My name is Michelle Magalang, and I am proud to be the moderator of this session called Expanding the Preservation Narrative from Research to Action as part of the Dismantle Preservation Virtual Conference. As the moderator, I just want to give just some logistics for today. As you can see, we have a very jam-packed and talented list of speakers that I want to give time to today. My name again is Michelle Magalang. I am a doctoral postdoctoral fellow, at the University of Maryland, School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. I'm also volunteer president of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. Currently today I come from, my location today is Los Angeles, California. So acknowledge that I am on the land of the Tonga people and appreciate being able to share the space with you today. So as you may be familiar with Zoom, if you have questions, you can add them to the chat box, or there's a Google document that's been circulating for this session. I will try my best to look at the questions. I won't be able to necessarily answer all the questions, but look at what are some of the major themes and topics that are emerging from a lot of the questions that we are seeing already. And so this session focuses on how we expand the preservation narrative by intersecting our research and our work as practitioners, professionals, and activists in advancing racial equity and historic preservation. The session is not intended as a diversity and inclusion catch-all session or continuing education session, but rather our goal is to elevate the works of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. BIPOC is the acronym we often use, doing preservation work in our respective communities and in solidarity in advancing equity and justice through our lenses as preservationists. So before we start off with our first speaker, I will ask quickly from each of our speakers to say their name, organization, or affiliation, gender pronoun. Like for myself, I identify as she, her, and hers, if you wish to share your gender pronoun, and where you currently are Zooming in from. So I think we'll go in order of the speakers, and I would love to invite Dr. McGregor first.
Aloha, I'm Davianna Pomaika'i McGregor. I'm a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at University of Hawaii Manoa and director of the Center for Oral History. My work in preservation is really perpetuation with the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana primarily. Today I'm here in Kuala Pu'u, Molokai in Hawaii.
Thank you. And can I have Dr. Hayashi?
Hi, my name is Kristen Hayashi. I'm the Director of Collections Management and Access and a curator at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, and I am in Pasadena, California today.
Thank you. Tejpaul?
Good afternoon. My name is Tejpaul Singh Bainiwal. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Religious Studies Department at University of California, Riverside, and I'm also a board member for Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. I'm joining from Stockton, California.
Dr. Jefferson? Alison?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Alison Rose Jefferson, and I am a historian and heritage conservation consultant, and I'm based in Los Angeles. And right now, my work is focused on sites of African American heritage.
Thank you. Free or Jeffrey?
Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Free Harris. I am an independent historian and historic preservation consultant based in Hampton, Virginia. And my current project is doing work on an historic context study of LGBTQ historic places in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Thank you, Free. Angelo.
Yate, everybody. I'm Angelo Baca. I'm Navajo and Hopi. I am a doctoral student at the New York University in the Culture Media Documentary Program in the Department of Anthropology. I'm also currently the Utah Diné Bikéyah Indigenous-led nonprofit cultural resources coordinator. And so I do a lot of work with folks who are coming into Bears Ears to learn about the landscape in a respectful way with the 5 Tribe Coalition and with the local communities here on the ground.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Gould.
Hi, my name is Zenaida Gould. I'm with Latinos and Heritage Conservation, and I'm interim ED of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute based in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm she, her, hers. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And as we kick off, we're going to start off, and it's going to go pretty fast. I've asked each of them to spend 8 minutes max talking about a project that talks about our theme today. So as we bring up, I'm going to stop sharing my slide, Dr. McGregor. I also want to note you may hear a little ding from me. That's my way of keeping time so we can make sure everyone gets a moment to present. So without further ado, Dr. McGregor, Davy, are you ready? I don't know if you're muted, Davi. Oh, you're muted.
I apologize. Aloha kako. This is a site of Manuela Hayao, which is on land that is owned by my extended family that my grandmother acquired in 1906. And this is land that has been put under stewardship of the community where it's located in Hauula on the island of Oahu, under the ownership of the Hawai'i Islands Land Trust. And one of the main ways in which we are moving from research into action is to have communities become involved in the stewardship of, restoration and stewardship of our heiau, which are our shrines, and partner with organizations such as the Trust for Public Land, and in Hawaii we have the Hawaiian Islands Land Trust, which is the owner now of this land. I will do a short chant in honor of my ancestors and this place. Aloha mauna wila I ka malie, malie I ka malu I loko pamawahu, holopuna iki ke kai ka palawa, halia aloha makua kaumana, mai ha'alulu I ka leo, e o ka ma'aina, e mauna limahana no keia aina e. Oya. And through the research of Dr. Rosanna Thurman for her master's thesis, Rosanna Thurman, archaeologist, we are beginning to date and reconstruct the history of this heiau and of the surrounding community. And through oral history, we have linked the heiau to one of the most famous prophets who came here with one of our ancestors in migration times. The next project looks at the island of Kaho'olawe, which is where most of my experience began in the idea of historic preservation. And this island was being bombed by the US Navy and used for target practice beginning on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed. And it was used for training practice for all of the major battles that were fought in the Pacific. They were first staged here on Kaho'olawe. And in 1976, we began a movement, occupation of the island, that grew into a long-term struggle to stop all military use of the island, which we succeeded in doing in 1990. And during that process, one of the things that the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana, which is the main organization in which I'm part of, we filed a civil suit against the US Navy for violation of the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Protection Act. And the Navy was then required to do a site survey of all of the island. These are some of the features that were found. On the right are two pictures of two different kinds of fishing shrines on the island. And to the left is a major training area for navigation on the island. And as a result of the survey, the whole island was nominated and placed on the National Register of Historic Places as a historic property, noting that there were 600 sites and about 3,000 features on the island, and that its importance was to see the whole island as a historic site rather than individual features, and that set an important precedent. And through our work, we also established that we needed to, even though this was a National Historic Property, the bombing could continue. So our ohana had to continue to organize against the bombing and begin to restore the sites. And we demanded and received access to the island for religious practices under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And finally, in October 22, 1990, the bombing and all military use stopped. And we're now working to restore the island and all of the different cultural sites and do our practices there. A third example is in Kenai Wailuanui in Maui, where we did a historic cultural landscape study. And the information that we gathered from that study showed that taro here and the pond had been cultivation in pond fields, and the irrigation networks that were still being used today were established from pre-contact times. The oral histories and the ethnography that we gathered have been used by the taro farmers shown here to demand that water be returned to their pond fields that were being diverted by the East Maui irrigation system for sugar and now for other development. So it's very important to use that, have that information gathered to establish this as a historic cultural landscape for that process of returning the water. The last thing I wanted to share, having seen the questions that were being asked, is an initiative of a Hawaiian archaeology enterprise called Huliau Pa'a. And they have brought together those of us who work in the field of historic preservation and perpetuation to form a collective we call the Kali'u Pa'akai Collective as a community of practice to begin to share what we feel are best standards for protection of our important ancestral spaces and places. And this is, I've shared here the call for action. We're especially concerned about protecting our cultural landscapes, our historic sites, and most importantly, our ancestral burial places, and to protect those places and to assure there's proper treatment of our kupuna who are found. I'll stop there. I have a minute left, but I'll stop there and give more time for questions. And those were the three, well, I guess four initiatives that we're working on here that is bringing our research into action for perpetuation of our place, historic and spiritual places. Aloha.
Mahalo, Davi. Maybe for your quick presentation. And so we will hold on questions and we will move on next to Kristen.
I lost the screen, but hopefully you can see my screen. Can someone say yes or no? I don't see anyone.
Yes, we can see
Thank
your
you.
screen.
Okay. Okay. Hi, again, I'm Kristen Hayashi. I'm a public historian, and I'm also a curator at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, California. And in addition to that, I'm a board member of the Little Tokyo Historical Society, which I'll mention a bit later. And I pursued a PhD in history because I wanted to become a museum curator and knew that I needed to become an expert in content. And so it's while I was in graduate school that I was introduced to the field of historic preservation. I've always considered myself a social historian, and so I realized how historic preservation could use aspects of the built environment to bring attention to some lesser known stories. And so I took a historic preservation grad seminar, and I wanted to develop a final project that would have meaning outside of the classroom. One of the case studies that I'll mention to you today began with that grad seminar final project. So serendipitously, I met members of the Little Tokyo Historical Society as I was shopping around for a project. And the Little Tokyo Historical Society is a group that's dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of Little Tokyo and surrounding neighborhoods. And the members were interested in designating the Japanese hospital in Boyle Heights as a City of Los Angeles historical cultural monument as a way to elevate the history of the site. And as you're probably aware, there's a huge disparity in the number of historic landmarks at the national, state, and local levels that represent communities of color and women. This is definitely true in the city of Los Angeles. A paltry 9 out of the 1,185 City of Los Angeles historic cultural monuments outwardly reflect the Japanese American experience, which these two sites represent. And only 2 of those 1,185 outwardly are associated with women of color. So I wanted to talk about these 2 sites, the Japanese Hospital and Tokyo Florist, because they help to tell a fuller story of Los Angeles's diverse past, and they're also landmark nominations that have successfully argued for cultural significance. The photos on the top of the slide represent the Japanese Hospital in Boyle Heights. In the first half of the 20th century, Japanese immigrants and their American-born children, as well as other ethnic groups, did not have equal access to adequate health care. And so in 1928, Japanese immigrant doctors had to navigate discriminatory legislation and ultimately take their case to the US Supreme Court in order to build a hospital for their community. And that's why this site is so significant. The photos on the bottom of the slide represent Tokyo Florist in Silver Lake, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles. And it was the residence and site of the Sakai Kozawa family's cut flower shop from the early 1960s to 2006. And you can see the workshop here on the left. You can't see in this overall shot on the right, but the family built these structures like the one you see on the left on the site in order to facilitate the inner workings of their flower business. And it's these structures that they created that I think make the site so unique. So I'll talk about some of the challenges and successes that resulted from the process of obtaining historic designation. First of all, there's extensive knowledge of the history of both these sites and others within the community, but I think there's a barrier to submitting nominations. It definitely requires a certain skill set to shepherd a nomination through the designation process. And this was certainly the case with the Japanese Hospital and Tokyo Florist. Individuals who had a wealth of information regarding the history of both of these sites were interested in obtaining a designation, but they didn't know how to proceed with the process or write a nomination. So there's definitely a need to bridge this gap. There have been various theme studies that have identified sites and buildings associated with particular racial and ethnic groups, especially in Los Angeles. These theme studies are supposed to be tools to help with the designation process, but I haven't really seen a community group using these theme studies to the full extent to nominate buildings and sites. So this remains a challenge. Some other additional barriers, what if the buildings that have importance for communities of color are no longer extant because of gentrification? Or what if it's a building's vernacular architectural style that makes it so unique? These are challenges that come up all the time with buildings and sites that have meaning for communities of color. What happens when the owner is a member of your community, in this case, the Asian American community, and opposes preservation because he or she is not aware of the process or the potential benefits of historic preservation? This was certainly the case with the Japanese hospital. And although we were successful in obtaining the local City of Los Angeles landmark designation, the owner's opposition prevented the Japanese hospital from being named to the National Register of Historic Places last year. What happens when a developer proposes plans that would potentially scrape away the structures on the site that anchors stories of an ethnic community's contributions to the region and the entrepreneurial might of women, leaving just a pretty Tudor craftsman house? This was the case with Tokyo Florist. These features that the family built on the site for their florist business were determined to be character-defining features in the historic cultural monument nomination. And yet after that we got that designation, a new owner obtained the property at the end of last year and proposed development on the site, which stakeholders felt would erase the history of Tokyo Florist. So as a result of opposing these plans, a working group was formed very recently, comprised of stakeholders, members of the city's Cultural Heritage Commission, a representative of the council member's office, and the developer, to come up with ways to preserve the history of the site while allowing for adaptive reuse. So this is still an ongoing process, but I think, we saw this as being, really hopeful and like a historic preservation success. So stay tuned on that one. Ultimately, these two examples have been success stories. The Japanese Hospital and Tokyo Florist have increased the number of Japanese American related historic cultural monuments in Los Angeles from 7 to 9. But I think more importantly, they have called attention to the discrepancy in sites that represent communities of color and women. Additionally, they have demonstrated that sites in Los Angeles are worthy of designation, not because of their architecture, but rather their cultural significance. And in both of these cases, the Little Tokyo Historical Society really had to advocate and garner community support for the landmark designations. And throughout the process, it was incredibly powerful for me to see a community assert that these places matter. This photo is from a sign dedication that we put up on a street lamp right outside of the Japanese hospital. And it was really important for us to do this because we figured that this way, people walking by could learn the story of the Japanese hospital. And so you see that it says immigrant Japanese doctors prevailed in 1928 US Supreme Court case. And hopefully that, piques people's interest to learn more. I think designating these sites helps to bring attention to these lesser known stories and histories, and really it's an act of social justice. So I'll end there. And
Kristen, we couldn't see the sign you were talking about at the end.
Oh, do you see the sign in the presentation? No.
There, we see it now.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did you see the first slide?
Yes, yeah, yes.
Okay. Okay,
yes,
there's
the
sign.
Yeah.
All right, I'll pass it on.
Great, thank you. And next we have Tejpaul.
Hello. Okay. So what I'll be discussing is kind of something that's very new, Sikh American historic preservation. So there aren't really many Sikh Americans doing historic preservation work or historic preservation in regards to Sikh Americans. So I'll just kind of be discussing some successes and my journey through it. So my introduction to preservation actually came a few years ago when I was interning in Washington, D.C. It was that's when I met Michelle Magalang through a mutual friend and was introduced to Asian Pacific Islander Americans in historic preservation. And following that, I was told that, API HIP wanted to come to Stockton and discuss the stories of Asian Americans in Stockton, and they wanted the Sikh American narrative to be part of this forum. So following that, there was a few meetings that I had, thanks to Michelle, with the National Park Service, and then API HIP eventually came to Stockton as well. And we were able to finally have a discussion about Sikhs in America and historical sites in regards to the Sikh American community. And then there was interest from the National Park Service to get Stockton Gurdwara, which is the first Sikh American Gurdwara in the United States. It dates back to 1912. And currently there's not a single South Asian National Historic Landmark. So this would have been the very first South Asian and Sikh American National Historic Landmark. But I was told that it's only a select elite group that writes NHLs. So from the very beginning, it was an uphill battle for me. And I was told that I could definitely overcome it, but I had to put in a lot of work because I was already at a disadvantage. So that was my introduction to preservation. And from there, I began my PhD program at the University of California, Riverside. And my entire focus has been researching Sikh American history. So some actions that came to be, I started working on the National Historic Landmark process for Stockton Gurdwara, but with the current administration, all of that kind of came to a very, very fast stop. So from there, my focus shifted to a more local landmark in Fresno County here in California, which was the San Joaquin Gurdwara. And I'll discuss more about that later in my presentation and the successes and the challenges I had with that. But in terms of the National Park Service and the Stockton Gurdwara, the resources that, what we're taught as a person of color is that our histories don't matter. And the current state of the historic preservation field kind of reinforces that. And, we have to kind of fight and find several allies and other groups. So one person asked in the questions, what is one of the biggest challenges and oppositions that I face with white historic preservationists? And it's just the ability to access and the ability to enter a room and have a conversation about Sikh American history and using my own narrative. And some successes, so just recently, well, a few years now actually, the National Register of Historic Places Multiple Property Documentation Forum for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in California. And although there were several issues that I had with this, one thing that I really appreciated was the inclusion of South Asian Americans. And I was also invited to partake in this, not as somebody who's contributing to it, but as someone who's reviewing the material and to ensure that the Sikh American story was discussed. So now with, specifically with the San Joaquin Gurdwara narrative. So I began this project back in 2017, and the Gurdwara is located in a remote town of San Joaquin, several miles west of Fresno. And the Tejpaul family originally settled in 1967, and by the mid-1970s, there was roughly 70 to 80 families settled. And by 1981, the Guru Granth Sahib, the Holy Scripture of the Sikhs, was brought to San Joaquin, and the Sikhs rented a hall. But although the current narrative of Sikhs in San Joaquin begins in 1967, there is proof that Sikhs lived in Fresno County since the 1910s, 1920s, and worked as farm laborers. So this history of farm laborers continued, and the Gurdwara was eventually built by several dedicated farm laborers, including the Mohar family, Randava, Dhaliwal, Tejpaul family, and so on. So the building itself is, although the Sikh community didn't own it until the late 70s, early 80s, the original building was built in 1922 and served as a former Chinese store, served as the city hall for the city of San Joaquin, the town of San Joaquin, and served as a bank. So it served multiple purposes. And eventually the Sikh community bought it, and the building remains intact in terms of the architecture. It remains relatively similar to what it was in 1922. We have documentation of photos from the 30s and 40s at least. And by the 1980s, nearly half the population of the city was Punjabi Sikh. So in 1983, the Gurdwara was eventually renovated. And from there, that's where the research really started. I spoke with an individual who was one of the founding members, and he expressed and informed me about San Joaquin Gurdwara. I myself was not aware of it at the time because, like I mentioned, we are taught that our histories don't matter. So once I was told about the story of San Joaquin Gurdwara and the fact that it was there since the early 1920s, I kind of started doing my research, and with the help of the Landmarks Commission in Fresno County, we were eventually able to get it designated as a county historical landmark just earlier this year in March. However, as the process continued, there were several complications. So the commission asked me to, dig or do some further research on the Sikh American community in San Joaquin and in Fresno County, and they even offered to help. However, when I asked them for the help, because these were experts in Fresno County, and they knew the history of Fresno County really well, they had no idea that the Sikh community was in Fresno for so long and have been there for over a century now, yes. And they had no idea that the San Joaquin Gurdwara even existed. So we have a group of historians, a group of preservationists in Fresno County who have no idea about the Asian American community, specifically the Sikh American community in San Joaquin. So it's something similar that I'm seeing even with the Stockton Gurdwara and several other projects that I'm working on, such as in El Centro, in Southern California, as well as the Vermont Gurdwara in Los Angeles. Although these are historical sites for the Sikh community, the general public doesn't really have any knowledge on it. And in terms of the general public, when I'm saying the general public, I'm referring to historians, preservationists, and individuals who would know about or should know about the history, at least the local history, if they claim to be experts. So this was one of the biggest hurdles for me, was to not only preserve the site and get it designated as a landmark, but also my responsibility to now teach historians, preservationists, and other professionals about the history as well. So, but again, like I said, it was a success. We were able to get it designated in March, and now the next main goal is, working on the Stockton Gurdwara to get that designated as well. So with that, I'll hand it back over. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tejpaul. I have to say, everyone's doing amazing with time. So I appreciate it. So up next, we have Alison. Alison, are you ready? You can unmute you, Alison. You're muted right now.
Okay, here we go.
Great.
Can you see
Yes.
my slides?
Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
Okay. So, you heard my name. I'm Alison Rose Jefferson. I'm a third generation Californian, and I'm a historian and heritage conservation consultant. I work independently. My research and interests revolve around the intersection of American history, the history of the African American experience in California during the 20th century Great Migration and Jim Crow era, heritage conservation, and cultural tourism in a spatial setting, with an aim to engage people of all ages through applied history projects in the struggle for social and environmental justice. I am interested, I'm also interested in my work's intersection with the experiences of people of African descent in other global settings. I first enrolled in a graduate school professional program to earn a master's degree in heritage conservation in 2003, and I graduated in 2007 from the University of Southern California. And after I earned this degree, I worked as a consultant in the preservation field for a few years. And then I realized that I wanted to broaden my platform for my future work. So then I went on to earn a PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2015. So both of my graduate school programs provided me with differing opportunities to enhance my knowledge and skills. My doctoral training in particular provided me with the space to enrich my subject area expertise for my future work life to progress in the way that I wanted it to. And this training gave me the foundation to continue to do research, write and publish, and to be an educator, and to hopefully do a variety of projects in applied as well as heritage conservation independently and in collaboration, in collaborations. To date, my research has informed my preservation and applied history work. The research I began in my master's program led to the landmark designation of Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in Santa Monica for its cultural significance in 2005. This church was established at 4th and Bay Streets in 1908, and it was the first spiritual and institutional center of the African American community in Santa Monica, and the first CME denomination site on the West Coast. The Church Project emerged out of research on African Americans in Los Angeles and leisure sites they developed in Southern California during the Jim Crow era. And aspects of this research resulted in other future academic and professional accomplishments inside and outside of these professional accomplishments inside and outside of academia, as well as academic papers and such. My research and the City of Santa Monica's 2005 landmark designation of Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church set the stage in 2008 for the official recognition with a cultural monument of the historic African American beach gathering place at Bay Street and Oceanfront Walk, and Nick Gabaldon, the first documented surfer of African American and Mexican American descent in the Santa Monica Bay. In 2019, Michael Blum of Sea of Clouds and I wrote the nomination for the same area to be listed on as the Bay Street Beach Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places for its cultural significance in the African American experience in the U.S. history. And it is a cultural landscape. There are no buildings there. There's a few things like a park and some structures where you can see this in one of these this flyer here. You can see that pagoda in the background. That's still there, but there's no buildings. So this is not, you know, the most common form of National Register listing. And as a matter of fact, it's the first historic district in Santa Monica to receive this national honor. And as you've learned earlier from Kristen, there's not very many of these sites, whether it be a National Register listed building or cultural landscape, that are associated with people of color in California. In my PhD program, I expanded my expertise and my knowledge base in US history, preservation, and applied history. I wrote a dissertation, which became my new book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, published by the University of Nebraska Press. My book rethinks the significance of leisure and public space for all within the long freedom rights struggle at California destinations. And I also discuss in the book heritage conservation issues around intangible heritage sites and the state of recognition of these sites as important places, which in most cases have not been landmarked. As a public historian, I've led coordination to facilitate remembrance of African American voices at Santa Monica's historic sites through the development of innovative programming partnerships between the Santa Monica Conservancy and Heal the Bay and other groups. This programming, such as Nick Gabaldon Day and International Coastal Cleanup Day and field trips for youngsters from South Los Angeles, actively connects diverse audiences to more complex, culturally inclusive stories of our collective national history and particular sites, in this case, the Bay Street Beach Historic District site, and also works towards the aspirations of environmental justice in policies involving beach access and civic action, and beach wildlife appreciation, and watershed stewardship intersecting with beach recreation. I am currently working on applied history projects dealing with the African American experience and particular sites during the Jim Crow era, with the Central Avenue Heritage Trail, with Angels Walk LA, and Santa Monica's Belmar History plus Art Project. The latter project includes an outdoor exhibition of interpretive panels on and public art, a context essay, grade school lesson plans, and other educational and informational programming, including a website that will bring the history of a particular area that was an African-American neighborhood that was displaced in South Santa Monica with the expansion of the Civic Center in the 1950s. And so this whole program is bringing to life for the present and future generations this history and the site of this neighborhood that was raised. Here again, with this, I'm drawing on my research to guide and enrich public programs in Southern California locales loaded with historical significance as well as contemporary consequences. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. Next we have Free, who he's gonna debunk the PowerPoint and present on his work as a preservationist. So we'll stop sharing. Yeah, perfect.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Free Harris. I am, again, based in Hampton, Virginia, as an independent historian and historic preservation consultant. And honestly, as I was listening to the presentations ahead of me, I decided to make a change, which makes me feel better about not having a PowerPoint presentation. I decided to put my historian hat back on and really explain how I came into the historic preservation world. So it began in the summer of 2002 when I had finished my US 1 comprehensive exams, and I was exhausted and tired and living in Washington, D.C. and studying at the American University, and knew that I needed, as a resident of D.C., knew that I needed an internship. And what I decided was that there was this beautiful building at 1785 Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. that I'd fallen in love with my first year at American. And it just so happened to be the headquarters at the time of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And when I found out that that's exactly what that building was, I sought then to go ahead and seek an internship. I got the internship in the summer of 2002, got a crash course that summer in the preservation movement. I was captivated. I was on my way to a good old academic career, but that preservation bug just sort of bit me a little bit. And in the fall of 2003, fall semester 2003, I was teaching my first course as an adjunct history professor, teaching freshmen. And I was hired to run the African American Historic Places Initiative, a Ford Foundation funded initiative that the National Trust had won. And I was hired in part because I was not fully an historic preservationist, but I had a background in academic history with an African American focus. So for the next 2 years, I spent that time really looking for the National Trust, looking for African American historic places across the country, and trying to devise more or less what was the state of African American historic places across the country, and how could academic institutions and preservation organizations work together to increase capacity, if you will, of African American historic places. So in the process, I put together a database of about 10,000 different African American historic places in every state, most of the territories in the country. And as that was coming to an end, and we were in the process of seeking additional funding for the continuation of the African American Historic Places Initiative, the National Trust created the Director for Diversity position at the organization. I applied for it, and luckily I was selected as the organization's first Director for Diversity. And one of the things that I am particularly happy about in having gotten that position was that I was then put in charge of the Diversity Scholars Program, the Diversity Scholarship Program that the National Trust had. And that was a program that brought diverse individuals to the National Preservation Conference. And in that capacity, I was able to look across the country and look at the folks who had applied for that program. And I did it for the 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008 National Preservation Conferences. And one of the people that I met through that program was Alison, actually. And I remember her vividly. So listening to her talking now about all of the things that she's done, I remember her when she was talking about, Huntington Beach and African Americans, doing, in leisure communities. I grew up in a town that had its own historic Black beach. So, it was one of those things where I was given the opportunity to meet people across the country who were doing diversity related projects. And it inspired me to then go out on my own and work as an independent consultant, because I really was inspired by the work that I had seen other people doing across the country. And I felt that I could be in a better position working on my own to give what I felt was really honest, advice, solid information that I didn't have to worry about whether or not I was, not towing a line properly, not, I didn't want to ruffle the unnecessary feathers. I'd rather tell people what they needed to be told. I'd rather tell the full truth as I could. And in that time, I managed to choose the best time imaginable to go out on my own, August of 2008. And we all know what happened in September of 2008. The bottom fell out economically. And I found myself with 2 solid contracts, and then thankfully was able to remain in DC for another 2 years working on those projects. But I knew that, I was going to have to really learn how to hustle and, really try to learn how to use those networks to move forward. And in the end, I ultimately decided to relocate back to my hometown in Virginia. And in that time, I ended up really more or less taking some time off to become a caregiver for my now late grandmother and helping out in that process. But when I was ready to come back, and that was in 2013, some of my old colleagues from the National Trust reached out to me when they knew that I was ready to begin again, and I started consulting again. And I decided that what I would do was initially focus on what I was trained in, and that was African American history, and work with my colleagues who were working on African American historic preservation projects. And in that, I've done a couple of projects, National Register nomination projects in North Carolina, getting 2 historic sites in the city on the National Register, the John Chavis Memorial Park, and the Barry O'Kelly School, which is a Rosenwald school there in Raleigh, North Carolina. I also, as an out gay man, had been keeping my toes, if you will, in the waters of LGBTQ historic preservation issues. And, just in so doing, I was asked to serve on the board of the newly created Rainbow Heritage Network, which is an organization that is dedicated to the idea of making sure that the preservation of LGBTQ historic places, that we have a seat at the table, if you will, in the preservation movement. And I moved from a board member to the board chair, and I'm the current board chair of the Rainbow Heritage Network. And through that work there and through those associations, I was asked to contribute a chapter to the nation's first government-funded LGBTQ theme study for the National Park Service. And again, like I said, I contributed the African American chapter of that work. And that has, it's been, what I've appreciated most about that is that I've been able, through my interest in history and through my interest in preservation, to have a continuous line in terms of the work that I've done. Moving the needle forward with regard to African American historic preservation issues. So, for example, I'm proud of the foundation that I put together with the African American Historic Places Initiative, and I look now at the African American funding behemoth that the National Trust has now become, on the foundation of that work that was done way back in 2003, in 2004, and 2005. And then to move forward to marry, my identity as an out gay man with my work. And I say all of this mostly to say that it's good to be able to look to who you are and have a desire to advance the history that's closest to you, and see that become a part of the sort of broader understanding and broader realm of the historic preservation landscape. And one cannot complain about having the opportunities to work on putting your history further on that map. And I will continue to do that until I take my last breath, happily so. Thank you.
Thank you, Free. And next we will move to Angelo. You unmute yourself. Angelo, if you can unmute yourself, that'd be great.
Great, here I go. So, can you see the slides?
Not yet.
Okay, let me see if I can get that going.
Great, we can see it now. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try to be quick about it because there is so much packed into all of this that I'm trying to cover very quickly. We're talking about, I don't know, thousands of years of history in several minutes. So let's just kind of go very quickly in this. What I wanted to cover is like a little bit basic background about this work. The Intertribal Coalition includes 5 tribes who are protecting the Bears Ears landscape. And so this kind of gives you a little bit of a view, a visual. And I like this map too, because it's very decolonial in its thinking. It doesn't have any borders or state lines or county maps on there. It's just kind of giving you a sense. The real borders are the rivers, the mountains, the valleys, the canyons. And you can see the areas of which we are inhabiting now in these spaces, where there's Navajo or Diné, there's the Hopi, Ute Mountain Ute, the Northern Ute folks, and then just below down there where you can see Flagstaff and Albuquerque are the Zuni. Now, all of these folks have vested interest in protecting these landscapes and can trace their heritage and their history back in these spaces, everything from ancestral sites and villages to current places of pilgrimages to family stories and places that are still being basically handed down through generation to generation in their stories through these families, clans, and tribes. So one of the things I really wanted to share about this is that my work in particular is contributing towards the issues of representation and self-representation. So what does that look like, and how can you tell the difference? Well, I think we can all agree that representations from the outside are usually problematic, sometimes discriminatory and racist at worst, and very limited in its scope at best. And it's important to be able to tell what kinds of these representations matter. And as we all see now in the national dialogue, the mascot issue is a big problem. And having representations that basically are all-encompassing for Indigenous peoples as like cartoonish mascots that don't actually exist in real life is a huge problem and a very consistent dehumanizing project. So what we try to do then is we make sure that our preference is self-representation, because nobody does a better job and knows our stories like our own communities themselves. So these narratives and visual images directly influence perceptions of the public and of each other. And what we know is that it cycles out into the popular culture world, as well as social media, and being shared into these news outlets, and they become into the record part of history. The problem with that is they usually don't talk to the Native folks or the communities and then get their ideas, their involvement, inclusion, permission. And so we try to do that. And this is an example here of like one of our local Native artists who made this image for the sake of the coalition. And nobody had a complaint about this image. Everybody loved it, actually. And you have to work in the tribal communities of Indian country to know that's a very rare occurrence. We very rarely agree on anything. I think it just speaks to the beauty of this idea that all these tribes came together and thought that this landscape was so important that they would actually put aside all their past historical battles and disagreements to save a culturally and spiritually significant landscape together. That is a historic moment that has never happened in all the thousands of years that we've been together here. So I think one of the things that we designed this guide that we developed, this media orientation and cultural sensitivity guide, to do was to correct mistakes and issues that were happening on the ground with folks who were coming on the outside in. So we would try to make sure things were correct with tribes, names, clans. We wanted to have people engage with the tribes and have at least a little bit of a small bit of history so that people could come from a correct place when they were trying to talk to these specific groups. We didn't want to have them use just general terms that were really American, heavy loaded historical baggage terms that were very problematic, like Indian or ruins or myth. We refer to them as like ancestral sites or villages. Like they're not ruins, they're actually living places. And we engage with our Native American communities, especially when we talk with folks from the outside, trying to have the key tenets of reciprocity, respect, cultural knowledge, and awareness of all these issues. So a lot of these storytellers that we encounter, the press, scholars, academics, filmmakers, artists, anyone who's doing or reporting about barriers, we try to do a real-time implementation and a direct intervention. So there's over 40 different press outlets, as you can see, even some big time ones that we have directly engaged with. And even when our Bears Ears summer gathering happens, which would have happened last week, but due to COVID is not for safety, we've had a lot of folks who were coming to this gathering, but we made it a mandatory training for people. Like you cannot even talk to people, take photographs, go interact with our elders until you take this training. And so we would walk them through this step by step just to make sure that they were course corrected before they even got started. And so this has to do with the larger conversation about preservation, because we have the dialogue between tangible heritage, which there are some images here that you can see that people classically regard as tangible heritage, actual things that you can see and touch and place under glass, versus the intangible heritage. And, there's this perception that they're all gone and that we don't exist, but that's far from the truth. You can see all of our nation's emblems here working together to preserve and protect this place. And so, we can preserve everything as the day is long, but those objects are limited in those interpretations, because without the people's knowledge, how do you know what those materials are, how you gather them, what the process is, how many families were involved in it, what the songs are, the prayers, the ceremonies, the stories, who it belongs to. And classically, there's a perception that, if we take this stuff and we stick it under glass in a museum somewhere, then we're preserving it. But this is something that we've pushed back on very hard and saying, like, actually, this land is the museum. You're the visitor. You get to come and approach it with respect, and you leave it better than you found it. So it doesn't go anywhere. It's right where it's supposed to be. You're the one that has to shift your paradigm in the way that you think and approach these things as you walk on these indigenous lands. So to tie all that up very quickly, we were trying to make the bridge a little bit easier for folks on traditional knowledge and Western knowledge together. We feel like there is a working relationship and balance that can be struck. It's just who's willing to take those risks to make that a reality. And our coalition took the first step. All those representatives of the tribes who went to President Obama to propose to protect this land with the Antiquities Act of 1906 was the first time it was ever leveraged for that purpose. Usually it's just kind of like co-opting a piece of land somewhere on our American landscape, and then that becomes into the American historical record. Whereas the tribes here came to the president and we said, this is important to us. We want this protected. This is our heritage. And it's a living cultural landscape, and the land isn't going to be without us. We want access to the food, to the firewood, to the water, to our ceremonial places. And we have, you know, the ability to just talk on equal and respectful grounds. And so that's been kind of in flux ever since the monument was designated, because we have pushback from this current administration. But we're trying very much to say that they can walk hand in hand. It's very obvious to see that the traditional knowledge of stewardship and practices of land are tied to health of humans and the environment. And so at its very basic, you know, premise, this is accumulated knowledge over long periods of time. It's observational data of generations of an environment. And so we're really trying to make sure that this is expressed in whatever happens next with our monument and our lands, because, you know, what the thing is, like, what isn't really understood is that this is home. We're not going anywhere, and we're going to be protecting it for generations to come, for future generations. And so however we can do that to leverage historical practices, you know, parks, monuments, or whatever mechanisms that exist, that we're going to do that. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Angelo, so much. As we move to our final speaker, Sarah, I want to acknowledge the chat. And as I have to say, honestly, coming from my own place, I feel like I'm being a teacher right now. There's a lot of great conversation happening right now, but I also want to make sure that we focus on the content that's being said with our presenters. There's a lot being discussed about standards on the National Register, which is great, but that's another conversation. And so I want to really honor, I see a lot of movement, and so I feel like I'm being a teacher and saying, please provide questions for us as speakers. Since we all can't watch what's happening, there's a really long conversation right now. So I just want to be really mindful and honor our voices. This was the intention of this panel, was to honor our voices and expand the narrative, not expanding the criteria, right, necessarily. We all operate with these criteria and standards, or not operate in a way that we comply, but, you know, in a sense of we understand what these are and the limitations. So I really want to spend this time highlighting our voices as speakers today. And so without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm gonna share my screen real quick. You see that? All right. I just want to say thank you for having me on this panel. I'm always happy for opportunities to recognize the grassroots preservation work that occurs in so many communities of color, sometimes outside of or even in direct conflict with historic preservation officials. So I'm a public historian based in San Antonio, where history can be seen in the landscape in nearly every corner of the city. It's a predominantly Mexican-American city, a predominantly working class city, where our culture is used to attract tourists. But at the same time, it's a city where our bodies are generally absent from important decision-making entities. When I moved to San Antonio, I'm a native Texan, so just know that. But when I moved to San Antonio in 2010, within about a year, I found myself volunteering with a group that was trying to create a historic district in the Westside, which is an important neighborhood in San Antonio's history, as well as an important neighborhood in terms of Mexican-American history nationwide. This group is the Westside Preservation Alliance, which I continue to be an active member of, which is a grassroots organization advocating for historic preservation in working class communities of color. At that time, my day job was at a state-funded museum where I was a curator, and a major part of my job was research, right? But what I realized was that we were really not doing enough work on this hugely historic community that was walking distance from our building. And so for me, volunteering in the community seemed sort of like a moral mandate to myself. From there, I got involved with trying to help with this historic district. Nothing really came of that, but we'll get to it in a minute. But in the process, I became kind of immersed in the local historic preservation policy and active in trying to challenge what has often appeared to be unequal application of our local preservation policy. And so a lot of my work is really based on trying to make change at the local level. And part of that reason is because, for better or worse, outside of San Antonio, a lot of people think that San Antonio does historic preservation really well. And I gotta say, meh. So eventually I changed jobs and ended up going to work in the Westside. I became the founding director of a community participatory museum in the Westside, the Museo del Barrio, the Museo del Westside, which is on your screen on the right. And on the left of your screen is one of many, many murals in the Westside. This one features an iconic historic building, La Gloria, which was demolished. And what we see over and over again in the Westside and in Mexican American communities across the US is that our historic buildings don't get designated and they get demolished. So I just quickly want to share two examples of unequal application of preservation policy that led to demolitions here in San Antonio. The first one, the one on your left, is that's the architectural rendering of the Univision building, or what we called the Univision building, originally called KCOR, or KCOR, yeah, it was both radio and TV, but this was the television station that started in 1955, the first full-time Spanish language television station in the United States. On the banks of the San Antonio River in downtown San Antonio. That was the building, very modern, very, the owner hired a hotshot architect from Miami to build it. As much as this is an important place to the Latino community across the United States, and even though our local Office of Historic Preservation recognized that the building more than met the criteria for historic designation, they still recommended that the building be allowed to be demolished. And what they said was the HDRC, that's our local Historic and Design Review Commission, should weigh the architectural significance of the building and its cultural interpretation against the proposed development. So they came down, they built riverfront condos, and that is gone. The building to the right is, of course, a less architecturally interesting building, and nevertheless a very important building. This was, at the time it was demolished, a no longer in business bail bonds business, but prior to that, for a long time, it served as the Valencia grocery store. And the Valencia grocery store was a business that financially supported a series of Mexican American community organizations, ranging from a whole array of Mexican American sports teams during segregation, and a bunch of social clubs for Mexican Americans, including the iconic Patio Andaluz, which is where the Westside Sound was incubated in the 1950s and 60s. And so the Westside Sound is this music genre born out of San Antonio. If you are familiar with the song 96 Tears, 96 Tears is riffing off of the Westside Sound. At the city's review board, when I submitted the application for this building, trying to get it historically designated so it wouldn't be demolished, one of the members of the committee expressed his confusion because he said he would understand if the case were based on the building's architecture, but because my application was pointing to our own city's criteria for cultural and historic significance, he said he was just at a loss. So again, it was in the policy that they could give it historic designation for its cultural and historical significance. but the folks who are on these boards don't know how to even interpret that. And this is a professor of architecture at our local university. In 2014, I was part of a group that founded Latinos in Heritage Conservation, which is a national organization modeled on APIA HIP, who we have some people from here, to bring more attention to the need to preserve historic sites connected to Latino history and to bring more Latinos into the field. We knew that the preservation movement is largely local, especially in communities of color, and that community groups and individuals have been hard at work addressing Latino preservation issues in their cities and towns across the US. But it's often hard to know, who's doing what and where, and how can we connect people doing similar work. So we wanted to create this national network that would serve as a platform for us to raise the visibility of heritage conservation in Latino communities, to empower individuals to see that they could do this in their own community, take direct action, sustain historic places that matter to them. We wanted to enable the creation of a collective voice on preservation issues affecting the Latino community. And this would, be a place where we can just, talk about the problems we're having, talk about our victories, share lessons. Very early on in this process, we came to understand that our organization is a social justice intervention in historic preservation. We know that the field of historic preservation is not neutral, that there are major blind spots in the field at large, as well as within local, state, and national policies. What we know, though, is that outside of the view of maybe mainstream professional preservationists, we are in fact doing the work, have been doing the work, continue to do the work, will always be here to do the work. So I just want to wrap up with a quote from Cesar Chavez, who said, "The fight is never about grapes or lettuce, it is always about the people." And heritage conservation, same thing, right? It's never just about the buildings, it's always about the people, it's about our belonging. And so if you want to think about, what can you do? Well, we need more people of color on preservation boards. And certainly white allies are great, but don't make decisions without us. We do consult, and yes, we do need to get paid. I would like to ask you to follow Latinos in Heritage Conservation on Facebook and Instagram, and watch out for an announcement. Next year, late summer, we're going to have our national conference in Denver. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to say, as we wrap up, we have a few minutes for discussion. And I actually want to kind of just pull together as the moderator some thoughts, as I would mention right before Sarah's presentation, that today's session, actually Sarah Marsom, thank you again, Sarah, for organizing Dismantle Preservation today, very much needed. Right, and Sarah reached out to me asking me just if I'd be interested in doing an hour session on expanding the narrative. And I could have easily said yes and just presented, right, by myself, just take the wheel. But instinctually, it was for me to say, how can we show how we as non-white faces are doing the work in preservation, as Sarah has mentioned. And so it was exciting for me because even when I sent out the invite for folks to be on this panel, I assume normally it's like 20 to 40% acceptance rate. The reason why you have 7 is because it had like a 92% acceptance rate to be on this panel, because it's important that we honor our voices. As much as we know we have a lot of limitations on, standards, not only on the National Register, and I apologize for the noise, my soundscape is Los Angeles. And so you may hear sirens, whatever. And so to me, it was important to show our faces. And as Sarah had mentioned, we are doing work. We've been here. It just wasn't sudden. For many of us here, and also I wanted to point out that there are folks here, another common thread is at some point in time, we are all part of a PhD spectrum, right? And that it doesn't all look the same for all of us, right? From those who just got, advanced to candidacy like Tejpaul to Free, who's like, I'm not gonna continue on, but understanding you know, the benefits of the training, right? We are all trained. We all had to become ABD, but that we all chose to do preservation work however we do it. And, you know, I come from a place where I was similar to Free, where I had left. I became MIA after being all but dissertation, ABD, and said I didn't want to go into academia, but came back to write the dissertation, knowing that actually we don't even get invited to the table necessarily unless we have those 3 letters. And I actually, you know, serving on the AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander theme study for the National Park Service, the staff there actually turned to me and said, you need to go and finish that PhD so we can hire you, because we can't hire you without it, right? And so how is that an issue? Not only are the standards, you know, part of a systemic racism and discrimination that we face, right? But we also even just our faces and showing up in these places. We got a lot of questions of saying, how can white people help, you know, BIPOC, right? And that kind of actually perpetuates our marginalization, right? In sense of also, Free had mentioned the National Trust has their Diversity Scholars Program that he helped create in the early formations. And just last week, I was asked by the Trust to serve on a task force, and I responded back, that sounds great. What's the compensation for my time? And I was given the response, we don't have money. So yeah, we can't. And like, honestly, I didn't respond because I didn't go to a university like UCLA and take out student loans to do things for free, to do free labor for predominantly white institutions that maintain racist systems and structures, and honestly don't see the need to fund us, right? We're seeing a lot of discussions on the chats about there's all these great things happening. Maryland just got a grant, which I'm actually working on. But you know, that's like one grant. It's not transformative work that's happening in the preservation field. And so this is what today's discussion was about. And so I actually want to throw out a big question, right, to any one of the speakers. What advice would you give to others who are here that are you know, wanting to do work in communities of color, whether it's being in their own communities or in solidarity with other communities? And how do we talk about centering our voices throughout every process, may it be inviting us to the table to whatever the end result, if it's National Register or whatever. What advice would you give for those? And I open it to there. Thank you. So I see Alison and Free.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I decided to go back and get a PhD is because I realized that having a master's in heritage conservation for the things that I wanted to do wasn't going to get me there. It was not going to be a big enough platform for me to work on, because in terms of one of the things that Michelle has just mentioned, and we talked about it generally, is that there are a lot of sites that are in our communities where there isn't necessarily a beautiful building. And in terms of the way heritage conservation in the United States, historic preservation is constructed, it's about aesthetics more than it is about cultural significance. And so I found for myself that if I wanted to, and then I wanted to work on supporting projects that I was interested in, and working in historic preservation at a historic preservation firm, generally the traditional ones that were founded by white people, well-meaning white people in many instances. You have to deal with what comes through the door. All the projects that I am working on now are things that have been dear to what my research interests were and what were spiritually important to me. And so getting the PhD having the experience in heritage conservation with a firm, having some other work experiences before, have been a great platform, excuse me, for moving forward with my work at this time.
So,
thank you. Great.
so I'm going to admit that clearly I am the lucky one in that I am ABD, but I did, bluntly put, I did rise pretty far into the ranks of the traditional historic preservation movement. What I wanted to say, one thing, thinking of what Sarah had mentioned, I'd forgotten to mention that I was appointed last year to the Virginia Board of Historic Resources. So I'm one of those individuals who gets to see the work that preservationists have done and help to decide what gets listed on the National Register from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that is it was an awesome opportunity. There are 4 people of color off the top of my head, 3 individuals of African descent, and one Native American who is Native Virginian, who is on the board. She's actually our vice chair, and our chair is an African American woman. So there are those opportunities, but in general, what I would say in terms of what we can do, I cannot stress strongly enough that we have to support one another. There are instances when I have come across people who do not do that. And that's not right. There's so few of us in this field that if we know of people who are doing things, if we know of opportunities or we hear of them, I think that it is incumbent upon each of us to make sure that if there is somebody who we know has the skill set to do these sorts of things, then we need to let them know that we know of opportunities. I have been doing that since my time at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And again, I'm proud of it. Like I said, I'm looking at Alison and I'm just smiles. I'm really just super proud. And, I think that we all can do that. It is a good responsibility to have. And that's what I would say to the younger individuals out there. Seek all of us out. And, we should be able to offer at least, at the very least, some guidance, if you will. So I really wanted to stress the idea that, we should see ourselves as a community within a community and act like that. Thanks.
Anyone else? Advice?
I was just going to say that I think it's important to the education component of all this, right? To I think educate like youth in our communities, to get them understanding of what historic preservation is and how this benefits their community. And the other thing, because I didn't learn about this until I was in graduate school, right? I think the other thing too is just, like I said, I think there's so much knowledge about these spaces and places that are of importance to, communities of color. I just think that there's this gap that they need, the tools, they need the education to understand, how to establish that these places matter. So I think that's how, professionals can help, diversify the narrative and expand, these sites and reiterate how important these places are.
Davy?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to share that the importance of gathering together like-minded colleagues to form a community of practice. And our experience in doing that here in preservation has been really very positive. Organizing to have people like myself who've been involved for a long time with younger people who are just going through the process for the first time, and also creating learning opportunities through internships. So the collective that we're formed also the Huliau Pa'a organization of Hawaiian archaeologists has received money from one of our Ali'i trusts to hold summer internships to begin to train young college students or individuals from the community who want to get involved and learn and be trained so that they can really learn the basics and be connected with communities. So the other thing that they do is they hold the training and the internship in different communities where they're trying to identify our cultural resources and to become involved in the stewardship of those resources.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about, you know, younger people in historic preservation. So I don't know, I just feel like it's all being directed towards me. So this is, you know, I'm in my early mid-20s. So for me, just like Kristen was saying, like I was introduced to historic preservation till, I mean, when I was in my early 20s. So I mean, it's only been 3-4 years now, and I was kind of just thrown into the deep end. And my only like life, like my only safety device was Michelle and API HIP, right? I didn't know what historic preservation was, but I was expected to kind of now become the voice of the Sikh American and South Asian American community, because there's not many South Asian historians and historic preservationists out there. So, I mean, everything that people are saying, like, you know, as a young person, I mean, having these mentors and people who are willing to guide me through the steps and kind of find these learning opportunities and internships, because for me, I'm still learning, and while I'm trying to also preserve the history and teach the history to individuals, but at the same time, I have no idea what I'm doing, and like I'm always just messaging, you know, Michelle and other individuals that I've met throughout the process.
Thank you. Angelo? And I know we're a little over time, so if Sarah Marsom is willing to give us a little more time, it'd be awesome. Angelo?
Yeah, I'd just like to add the ability to be creative and innovative in getting these histories more, I guess, accessible and interested into various groups, such as youth and different communities that share the same areas as we have here. I think what's really helpful is the fact that we try to do so much across many platforms, social media, internet, virtual reality, photogrammetry, just like, you know, oral interviews and historical accounts, I think are extremely important. I mean, as Indigenous communities, we don't have like papers and buildings in, you know, like what would be considered in Western frameworks as something to be underneath the heading of history. So a lot of our stories and our places, that knowledge is handed down from generation to generation. And so we found ourselves having to be especially creative and especially nimble when it comes to technology. And I think that's important, especially now in this time of COVID, because so many people are at home and are not able to be connecting interpersonally. But also this landscape in itself is very rugged and remote. Not everyone can get here or move about in it. And so those things are really helpful to communicate the importance of these things historically, so that people will understand why it's so important for us to preserve them. Thanks.
Thank you, Angelo. And I actually want to tie that back with what Angelo and Tejpaul are saying. As much as it may be elders teaching, younger folks mentoring, I think I believe in the model of just this community of practices, as Davianna mentioned, where we all teach each other. Because I know technology stuff that I don't do all of like TikTok and stuff, but it may be relevant, right? And it may be a way to engage a larger audience. And so, you know, for us, it's retention, not only from in terms of like an age spectrum, right? From older to younger, but just like we can always engage folks at different, you know, generations. And, you know, as Sarah had mentioned, API HIP is one where our model is, if you look at our board of directors, they're not all people who, none of them are actually from major corporations or anything of that nature, but they actually are practitioners of preservation and different, you know, ages, different experiences and things of that nature, so that we actually at API HIP really practice this community of practice, right? We support each other. If there's a threatened site and we don't know what to do, next steps, often we engage our board and our allies to even come up with, strategies and plans of action. And so we know that, I mean, I don't know anything about Section 106. I don't know if anyone here knows about Section 106, but, and I can't name the standards by, backwards and forwards. I don't know it very well at all. But that we actually come as specialists from our community, and the way that we expand even the definition of preservation on our terms, not just by our positionality, but in our own research and in our expertise. And so this is actually, we're 4 minutes over, so I appreciate everyone staying on so far, and I appreciate the conversations that are happening in the chat. At some point I'm gonna have to download the chat and read everything, so I apologize that we weren't able to necessarily answer all your questions. And as I wrap up, I actually want to give a plug. I'm at University of Maryland. I'm a postdoc there. And actually in April, we were supposed to have a research symposium similar to this topic, and everyone on this panel actually was invited to speak. But unfortunately, due to COVID, we were not able to do it in April, and we're postponing it. And initially we were gonna look in October. We have not set the date, but we're looking to do it in a virtual platform in January, give some time from breathing room for us in the fall, where we will center our conversations, and you'll hear more from these presenters about the work they do in framing how do we do our work in preservation, as you've heard today, about social justice, centering it in terms of justice and equity, shifting from diversity inclusion, which is still important, but shifting that to be more expansive, to look at justice and equity through the work we do. And so I want to thank everyone again for your contributions today, as both speakers and as those attending. And we look forward to engaging more and more. This is not a one-time discussion. And so thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. You get a 2.5-hour break at 8 p.m. Eastern Time is Burning Down the House, which is 6-minute lightning talks. And I would like to just reiterate what Michelle said. This is not where the conversation stops and ends. This is not where the conversations don't lead to actions. We expect great things from all of you in the coming days.